Great taste. Sweet. Sour. So good to taste.
Welcome to Great Taste. I'm your host, Steve Boss. 60 minutes of deliciousness upcoming. My guest is Dwight Garner. His latest book is The Upstairs Delicatessen on eating, reading about eating, and eating while reading. Or in the book, when he's writing about popcorn reading parties, he suggests an alternative title, Books and Butter. Either one works for me. His work also includes two other books, Garner's Quotations, A Modern Miscellany, and Read Me, A Century of Classic American Book Advertisements. Plus, Dwight's written numerous pieces over the years that have appeared in the New York Times Magazine, Harper's Magazine, the Times Literary Supplement, the Oxford American, Slate, the Village Voice, and The Nation, among other publications. He was the senior editor of the New York Times Book Review from 1999 to 2008. In 2008, he took the post of book critic for the newspaper. And he writes in the Upstairs Delicatessen that I like finding a good book review in the morning paper. That's part of why I keep writing them. Welcome to Great Taste, Dwight.
Oh, it's great to be here, Steve. Thank you for having me.
Well, I have to tell you that this book was one of the most charming, and that's not even a good word, actually, but it's part of the words that I would like to use. One of the most charming reads of my entire year. It's a book that caused me to actually look up a lot of references. Most books don't spur me to do those kinds of things. And I learned a lot from the book, which is really, that was a very great experience for me. I only read it once. The New York Times, Jennifer Reese, who reviewed the book in the New York Times, said she read it 3 times. And I remember reading that and going, are you kidding me? There's no way. But I've already started number 2. So I'm sure I will get there to number 3 because it's captivating. I think I want to try this, actually. I didn't want to do it here, but I'm going to try it right now. I think you can open the book. I know I can open the book to any page whatsoever in the book. So I'm just going to do that. I've got the book right here. I'm just going to randomly open it. Okay, here we go. So let's see what I can find. This is very funny, actually. Compared to, in relation to what we were talking about before we started, which was the peanut butter and pickle sandwich. The other sandwich of my West Virginia youth that lives on in my mind and in my kitchen, to Cree's dismay, Cree is your wife, is fried bologna. Robert Sietzema, the great New York City food writer, is a devotee. He once worked in a Texas hospital where there was amazingly, quote, a hot vending machine that sold nothing but fried bologna sandwiches on biscuits, oozing grease, and mustard. I've scoured eBay for one of these to no avail. So I rest my case. I think that that was proven. You can turn to any page in this book, and it's just quite extraordinary. The one sentence, though, that stood out in the review that Jennifer Reese wrote about the book in the Times was, for those of us who live to read and eat, this book is a feast. So that's what I imagine that line had to feel good when you read that line, if you read the review.
I did read the review. No, it's such a nice review, and it's I feel very lucky as a book critic myself to have gotten such strong reviews for this book, because you just never know, it's a crapshoot. It's funny, I never really believed, I've written book reviews for most of my life, and I've edited them for a long time, and I never quite believed critics who say, I immediately went back and read it again. I always think to myself, no, you didn't. But now that someone said about my book, well, of course, it's my book. Of course you treat it. I'm joking. But it was a very sweet review. And, this book was just a chance to fit in a lot of observations that I had about the food world. And, I organized it, breakfast, lunch, shopping, drinking, dinner. And it's just a chance to put in things like Robert Sietzema's hot fried bologna sandwich machine that no one else might have known about, but I still want one.
Thank you for correcting my pronunciation of his name, too, by the way. I appreciate that.
Oh, it's okay.
Yeah, good. I've always wanted to know how to pronounce his name, too, throughout the years. So for me, I have to just say that it's also a book that I feel like I can hang around with. It's one of those things that I wouldn't put it on a coffee table because I want it right next to my bed, actually. Because at night, I could just pick it up, and as I did, turn to any page and find something that would charm me in an entertaining way, in an intellectual way, actually in a spiritual way, really, because I likened it, and I hope no one takes offense to this, to like a Rumi book, a poetry book, because I identify food with spirituality and all the sublime mysteries of life. And that's exactly how I feel this book, that's the type of effect it had on me. Let's put it that way.
Well, thank you. I mean, I'm honored and I'm charmed. So far, people have seemed to like it. I mean, I just don't, I don't know. You put these things out in the world, you don't know what people will make of them. But I certainly, it may be a reflection of the fact that I had a great time writing it. I enjoyed it. I have a full-time job at the New York Times, and I wrote this book on mornings, sort of in different places and mostly coffee shops. And I realized as I was going, I'm just really enjoying it. And I hope that some of that joy sort of spills over into the book itself.
Yeah, there's a part in the book where you actually talk about reading, that you read 6 to 7 hours a day. You wrote that you keep a sentry lookout for the food and literature. And then you said you don't do that in a comfortable spot because you would fall asleep, but rather in parking lots, libraries, and quote, I read and write in coffee shops for an hour or two or three most days. So I say to you, you said, oh, when people say they read your book, more than once, and you go, no, they didn't do that. Really? That's how you work, actually?
Well, if you have to read a lot every day, it doesn't behoove you to get very comfortable. You put me in a comfortable chair, even with a very good book, I'm going to be napping in about an hour, And so, excuse me, I don't get comfortable. I move from libraries to bookstores. Sometimes I'll read in my car. I live in New York City now, and I don't own a car. But when I have lived outside the city and have a car, I'll just drive to the beach or to the mountains and sit in the front seat, or in the summertime outdoors and read. I have friends who sometimes go to the theater in New York and can't help themselves. They're in a comfortable chair in the dark. They fall asleep. That's a $300 nap if you know what New York City theater prices are these days. So yeah, I don't get comfortable for the most part. And people ask me pretty often, how can you read so much? And what I say often is, most people read a typical book in about 8 hours. The problem is most people devote 20 minutes a day to it, perhaps, if they're lucky. And so the book can seem to go on for 2 months. But if you're someone like me who has the time to do it, I can read a book pretty easily in a day. And it's not that I read faster than other people, though I'm pretty fast at this point. It's just having what some politician called an iron butt when it came to negotiations. I have an iron butt. I can read for a long time.
Now, you've been doing this since you were little. You describe that in the book. Have you ever, I'm just curious, I did this, so I'm just curious if you've done it. Have you ever calculated approximately how much of your life you've devoted to reading and eating?
God. Oh God, it'd be terrible, wouldn't it? I was reading some novel. I think Rachel Cusk wrote a novel, and she imagined as a parent seeing all the crap. I won't say crap. Let's say nice stuff she had bought for her kids over their childhood, all spread out over a mountain. Just all that stuff. And don't you think, wouldn't you weirdly like to see or not like to see a pile of every donut you've ever had just in a big pile somewhere? I don't know. Who can imagine it? Yeah, but I review a book a week for the Times. There's 8 hours right there, let's say, but often the book is larger than that. Often it takes reading 2 or 3 books because this is the author's 4th novel, and I'll go back and read the previous ones. So yeah, a ton of reading and a ton of note-taking, because I take very serious notes on what I read. And that note-taking has in many ways led to this book, because I have a good memory for things from books, but also I write them down and I can go back and find them. And some of that stuff is in, some of the foods material is in this book.
And did you use, I noticed one part in the book, you double underlined a passage. Is that some particular methodology that you use, or do you actually take the notes, or do you do both actually in terms of, I was amazed at where in the world did you, were you able to come up with all this material that obviously is part of a lifetime of reading?
Right. Well, I've kept, since I was very young, since I was a teenager, a commonplace book. And some of your listeners may know what a commonplace book. It's just, it's a book where people throughout history have written down favorite lines and other things from books, and also sometimes in a sort of a diaristic way, things people have said. And these meant a lot to people back in the day before books were common objects, because you mainly get to borrow a book for a week and you have to give it back. I mean, there weren't so many books early on. And but I've kept a commonplace book since I was in my teens, and it started off being all this really dumb. When you're a kid, the stuff you think sounds important is usually kind of the ridiculous stuff that sounds like stuff like life is like a box, not life is like a box of chocolates, but oh, life, it's like the ocean, or and you think that's a good line. And then you grow up, and no, it's not such a good line. And over the years, I've just kept up this practice, and now my commonplace book is quite large. It's on several computer files, and I file. I love good sentences, and I put them in. I have a whole section of quotes about cars. And transportation, travel, food for sure, social class, flying, conversation, theater, film, music, and these have gotten pretty large for me. And luckily, even though my memory isn't perfect, I have a good memory for quotes. But I also have kept food quotes that I love, and I was able to use some of them in this book.
And that is a large portion of the book, but I want to just focus for a minute or two on your own writing, because I loved how you weaved your own story through this book, through the quotes of these different literary figures. And some of the writing that I wrote down, took notes on, I think is just marvelous. So I'm going to just share a few of these excerpts. One, I've looked to novels and memoirs and biographies and diaries and cookbooks and books of letters for advice about how to live, the way cannibals ate the brains of brilliant captives, seeking to grow brilliant themselves. Or your almost lifelong fondness for, quote, the cuboid bits of crunchy salt at the bottom of certain pretzel bags, almost unholy in their deliciousness, worthy of cutting on a mirror, sorting and rubbing on the gum line. I mean, I was one of those kids who picked those bits off, so I really related to that too. but there were other observations that I'd like to share. You've mastered the stick shift I discovered while young, when you can eat a plate of rice and beans that's on your lap while driving in traffic. Really?
So true. Definitely.
Salty, fatty, crispy, and spicy, the basic food groups, essential building blocks for happiness, more all-American than apple pie. And then this description of a former neighbor of yours in the West Village. The neighbor downstairs was a self-identified Satanist who liked to show off his collection of shiv-concealing umbrellas. He boiled and roasted beef bones all day, in parentheses, I hope they were beef bones. The unholy reek came up through the floor. And finally, well, there may actually be some others. Oh, yeah, not finally. I like the smell of sauerkraut, which, of course, is made from cabbage because it generally indicates that sausages are nearby. And right at the moment, we'll close with this one, because you, at some point, you raised chickens in one of the places that you lived, right?
Yeah.
And so you wrote, all writers should keep chickens at least once. Striving to avoid cliche, they could appreciate where most of those in Raglish come from. By the way, I looked that term up. I couldn't figure it out.
Raglish? That sounds like a misprint. In English, it should have been, I think.
Should have been English.
Yeah.
I couldn't find the term, so I'm glad you.
Raglish. Sounds like that should exist. Anyway.
I thought, okay, rag, like they call newspapers or rags,
right,
or whatever, but oh well. So here's the quote from the book. So it's, all writers should keep chickens at least once, striving to avoid cliche. They could appreciate where most of these in English come from. Ruling the roost, pecking order, egging on, henpecked, fox in the hen house, and other commonplaces become abstractions no more. The cliche, scratching out a living, is especially poignant when you are freelancing.
Go ahead.
I got to do one more. I'm sorry.
All right.
Because this is one that I love. Chefs hate it when you ask your server for salt. Cree and I once asked for salt in one of the Chef Wiley Dufresne's post WD-50 restaurants in Lower Manhattan. The man himself stomped out of the kitchen to get a look at us. We really saw the hostility at work beneath the bonhomie. What could we say? His food needed salt. So all the credit that you give to many different literary figures, I want to just throw back at you, because I admire the fact that you can, as somebody who likes to write but doesn't write anywhere near like you do in terms of the beautiful crafting of those words. I'm very appreciative of getting the chance to experience reading it.
Oh, well, you're very kind. It's funny. This book is about 50-50. It's sort of half well, maybe let's just say 50-50 for now, half memoir and half sort of observations about food. And I think I did that in part because I realized that, I've been debating for a while writing a memoir. And it occurred to me, I'm a book critic. My life isn't that interesting. I didn't grow up in a war-torn country. I've never been attacked by a bear. I sit around and read all day, and things have happened to me, and there's something there. But I felt that, I didn't really have the right amount of trauma to write what passes for a memoir these days, at any rate. And so I decided to mix it up with food. And I hope the personal bits work, but they're there sort of to work in and around as sort of the stuff that glues the rest together.
Well, speaking of not having any trauma, I actually do have a passage here that you associated trauma with food. I'm just trying to find it. And it had to do with you were out on a boat and you couldn't, let's see. Unfortunately, I'm not going to find it really fast, but basically you're out on a boat and you were, oh, here it is. A friend and I were on a small boat that ran out of gas in the Gulf of Mexico. We drifted and bobbed for 6 hours and into the night, slowly becoming terrified we'd never be found. Our food dreams ran almost entirely to McDonald's quarter pounders with cheese and French fries. Now, so you do have some trauma. Now, for me, I wanted it to say something like, because I want to know, well, what happened? Who found you? That kind of thing. I said, when a friend and I were on a small boat that ran out of gas in the Gulf of Mexico, and we drifted and bobbed for 6 hours into the night, slowly becoming terrified, thinking that we'd never be found until the dolphins rescued us.
Sorry, I guess I left a cliffhanger in there. No, just a passing fishing boat saw us and threw out a line, and dragged us home. But, our parents had called out the Coast Guard and there were boats out searching for us. All of our friends, we came home to a hero's welcome, and it was really, looking back, it was nothing. It was sort of from 3 p.m. to 9 p.m. on a summer day in Naples, Florida growing up, but it was terrifying for us at the time. But yeah, we did not get McDonald's. We had pizza, and it was damn fine pizza.
I think you'll get a kick out of this. It just occurred to me that we have 2 kids. You have 2 kids. When the first kid was born, my wife's father was a pediatrician, and he came to the hospital immediately, and he, as they do, I guess they still do. I think they still do. They do an initial examination on the child. And at that time, now I think they do it in the room, if you're in a birthing room, for example. But now, in the past, they used to take the baby away with them. And my wife said to me, follow him and don't let our son out of your sight. And I'm like, wait, that's your father. He's a pediatrician. But I did what I was asked to do. Now, when the second child came along and the nurse said, can we take her to have her examination? We said, sure. And I ordered a pizza.
That's totally great. My wife did the same thing. That's very funny. She made me follow, the nurse, as I recall. Don't take your eyes off this baby. Crack me up.
That is, and speaking of your wife, she plays a significant role in the pages of this book, actually. She was raised by a father who was a chef and restaurateur on the West Coast. And you wrote, the family I was marrying into was a long way from ham and cheese sandwiches, potato chips, and drinks made from powder. Cree grew up taking leftover frog legs to school in her lunchbox. When I met her, she was in flight from her foodie past. She'd become a vegetarian and was eating the same sort of co-op meals I was. We took hold of each other's lapels and shook like hell. Our appetites awakened. And then I proposed marriage to her in Tallahassee, Alabama, in a restaurant known for its fried chicken. So my question to you is, your West Virginia upbringing and her upbringing were very different. And how did that affect you and your approach to food, or did it, in terms of once you got together with this person who had other sensibilities?
Yeah, I mean, she's sort of the foil to my character in this book, and she is in life too, because she just grew up. Her father was a very earthy, very well-known, earthy. He sort of cooked, French farm-to-table food back in Aspen, Colorado, and in Idaho in the 60s and 70s and early 80s, also in the Napa Valley in California. And these were the kind of restaurants people would fly into just to go to these restaurants, and they were expensive, but they're also just it's kind of restaurants where you get your table for the whole night. That's how it worked there. And then, but he was very unpretentious. And Cree grew up, cooking in these restaurants and serving in them. And she just had all this built-in knowledge that I was so envious of, because I would already, when I met her just after college, we were both in our early 20s or mid 20s, let's say. Um, I was already on my journey, I will say, to learn more about food. I've been reading a lot more, reading Calvin Trillin and writers like the novelist Jim Harrison, who writes about food a lot, and Jada Michael Stern, who wrote quite a lot about food. They have these series of books called Road Food that they did back then. And I was on my way, but meeting Cree really sort of sent me for a loop, because she just has she's the kind of person who can take a bite of something, and that bite has like 4 different stages on her tongue. She will just break down everything that's in it. And I will say, this is delicious. She will say, well, and just break down all the herbs and what. She just has a great palate. And she likes very simple foods, very sort of Alice Waters in a way, the owner of Chez Panisse restaurant. Very sort of fresh things, very simply prepared. That's her idea of a meal. My idea of a meal often has, a whole pig on the table and something covered with cheese on the side. And I'm joking a little bit, but I like all sorts of food, and often what she calls stunt food, which is something huge and grilled, and whereas she would like a simple piece of fish and some perfect vegetables. So those are our differences, but I am envious of her childhood. She just has, she just doesn't need, she's written about 7 cookbooks, but she never looks at recipes because she just knows what to do.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I'm more with you. I would say it was delicious.
Yeah.
I do want to actually read a couple of quotes from the book when you're writing about her. When I'm traveling or Cree is away, I live for eating alone, though many find the experience painful. Alone, I can cook something Cree would go out of her way to avoid. It's nice to cook without feeling Alice Waters is peeking over your shoulder. And then on page 36 in the book, I have to put my glasses on so I can make sure I can read this properly. She can taste something. This is what you were talking about.
Yeah.
She can taste something and instantly break down its flavor components. I sometimes won't notice something tastes funky until I've nearly polished it off. Like her father, she invariably wants fresh things simply prepared. So do I, but I have a weakness for unusual ingredients and show-stopping dishes, stunt food in her lingo. I recognize myself in dialogue from Gogol's, right?
Gogol, yep.
Gogol's Dead Souls. When I eat pork at a meal, give me the whole pig. When mutton, the whole sheep. When goose, the whole of the bird. Most of our fights are about food, although the real issues are as deep and layered as a casserole. And then the note is her least favorite food.
Casseroles. Yeah, we were just in New Orleans for a while. We lived there for 6 months during COVID. And New Orleans is one of the great food cities in America. But for Cree, she was not entirely taken with it, because her idea of great food and the word casserole brought this to mind. New Orleans cooks love to put something on top of something and something under that and stuff it with this. And Cree's theory is, well, if it's so great, let's just have it simply, And so we disagree a lot about stuff like that.
And the sensibilities, as you pointed out, are all so different. She has never, to the best of my knowledge, eaten in a food court or on an airplane because it wouldn't occur to her. Why not wait for something better? I smell the warm cookies in first class and can't wait for my little tub of indistinct protein. Okay.
I'm always hungry. She can wait. She's like a camel, in the desert. She can last a while. The tension in our relationships is great. I spend most of my time reading cookbooks. I love to read cookbooks, and I look for things that I dream she will cook for me. I mean, I can cook, and I'm not bad at it, but she's much handier than I am. And she's much, we all know people who are certain people in our lives who are just very calm in the kitchen and just are not easily ruffled, kind of enjoy it, laid back. When I'm in the kitchen, I'm a little stressed out, and something's going wrong here, and there's 3 things boiling here, and I kind of lose my stuff. And Priya's never like that. So I'm always trying to find things that are ways to convince her to cook for me. And it's hard because she just would rather cook what she wants to cook.
And shopping also, she's much different shopping as you write. Cree is this kind of shopper. All of Manhattan is her backyard. She sniffs and samples, peeks and palpates. She's demanding and charming, and butchers and fishmongers take to her immediately. I lack the haggling personality. When I sniff and peek and palpate, no one's eyes twinkle. I'm merely some shopkeeper's problem.
It sounds like I put myself down quite a lot in this book. I may have to go revise. If there's ever a second edition, I gonna put some nice stuff up myself in there. But it's true, you know. It's fun to watch a good shopper, right? One of the things I talk about in this book is observing some good shoppers, and I admire the art. I always come home with the berries that have started to go bad, and I don't notice, or I pick the wrong watermelon, and I'm always frustrated. So I admire the good shopper, and Cree, my wife, is one, and she's taught our kids to be great shoppers as well.
Well, my problem is that I think I'm a grape shopper, and then I come home and my wife goes, "Did you see this bruise on the back of this? That's like we have to cut half of it away." You know, and it's like,
Right.
okay,
Or I get, did you not know that asparagus is not in season right now? And
right.
I don't know. To me, everything's in season now because everything's flown in. But she knows that the asparagus doesn't taste as good out of season, and she's right. But I forget these things.
Right. So you are self-effacing in the book quite often, which I guess I found to be endearing. And but there are other aspects to your writing that are not really that don't really deal with humor. There's an emotional part, a much more subtle part. Here's what passage. There's an emotional you were working in a bookstore.
Yeah.
There's an emotional ghost weight I learned that attends book selling. People come to the register with their hearts in their hands, laying in front of you books about depression and cancer, loneliness and divorce, underachieving children and abusive spouses, or something sad and funny, and at the same time, like the diverticulitis cookbook. Ruth Rogers, who owns and runs London's River Cafe, has said restaurants are similar zones. We think of them as places we go to celebrate, but it's as common to have a customer learn over their frisée au lardon they're being divorced or fired. I think that those are things that most of us don't ever really look at when we're thinking about food, and yet you're actually peering into completely other area that is extremely revealing.
Yeah, it's funny. A lot of young people ask me, people who want to get into the world of words, who want to be book people, whether writers or editors. And excuse me, I'm getting over a cold and my throat's a little rough. But one thing I say to them is that most of my life as a kid and as a teenager and even after college, I worked in libraries. I worked in bookstores, many of them, like 3 or 4 different bookstores, several libraries, other kinds of work like that when I was young. And it really, you learn more than you think, just sort of by osmosis being in those places. And I'm glad I had those jobs. And, it's true. It is like working in a pharmacy, working in a bookstore, because you think you're selling novels, but you're not. You are, but you're also selling all kinds of books that you forget are what drives the majority of sales in this country, which is sort of self-help and other kinds of books about health and that kind of thing. And I miss bookstores, it's still my favorite places. They don't, not so many of them anymore, are there?
No. And there are other topics that you explore too that I know that you come at with a completely different angle. So fast food being one. And I would appreciate if you would just, talk a little bit about this very complex topic. You, for example, quote another author in the area where you're talking about fast food who was writing about an experience at Bojangles, I believe.
Right. That was George Packer, who writes for The Atlantic, talking about sort of, these midnight trucks that burn through America, filled with these chickens that were inhumanely raised in sort of poor quality, and just the sound of them. He has a farmer on the porch listening to these trucks passing in the night. And it's kind of a moving scene in his book. But, fast food, it's so complicated, isn't it? I mean, I do not turn my nose up at fast food, and I like it a good deal, at least certain kinds of it. I try not to eat it too often. And or George Orwell, the author of 1984, and many other books that I like more than that one, his journalism. But, said that, when you're poor and hungry, what you long for is not a good apple. You long for something more sustaining. You want a bit of grease and a bit of salt, and it's consolation. And as another writer I talk about, he talks about how well, I'm going back to consolation again, but talks about how if you're a family and you're not wealthy, how fast food is this inexpensive night out. And it's not worth looking down on things like that. I see all the problems, of course, with relying too much on fast food in this country. And the more you know about it and how it is prepared, the less you do want to eat it. But I live now. I'm in New York. I'm in Harlem, in an area of Harlem called Hamilton Heights, and there's no good pizza near me on my block. And often I'll come home late at night, having been out, had a few drinks with friends, and you know what it's like. Sometimes you want like last bit of bite before you go to bed to settle your stomach, and the only thing open on my block, or even for 2 blocks, is McDonald's. And I go in there probably once every 3 weeks and grab a double cheeseburger and fries as my 2 a.m. meal. And I just love it. But having said that, I try not to do overkill.
Right. So there were a couple of references to film in the book that I liked a lot. One was a film with my favorite actress of all time, Audrey Hepburn, and she was starring with Cary Grant in the movie Charade. And you actually say that it contains the loveliest eating scene in the history of film, though it lasts only a few moments. And just for people to, this is one of the instances where I actually looked at the film to try to find that particular, you didn't tell us where it was. And it was actually 1 hour, 17 minutes and 34 seconds into the movie. And it's very short, but I wonder if you could just describe why to you it's the loveliest eating scene in the history of film.
Well, Audrey Hepburn is this woman who, and men are after her for her money, and one of them might be, Cary Grant in the scene. But they're on a boat on the Seine River, and they're sort of they're dining while on this sort of barge, and they're going under arches, and you hear their conversation sort of bouncing off the stonework. And there's a salad plate in between them, and she's just serving the two of them salad with a large sized spoon and fork. It looks to me like, and just her way with them is so deft and so charming. The way she composes the salad, that you think to yourself, this is how every human should comport themselves at the table. Just the way she serves herself. Clearly, her manners are excellent. It's just so charming to watch someone eat that well. And it's painful to know that you will never yourself probably enjoy that level of sophistication to be able to do that. But it's just a lovely moment of grace in this movie.
And then it's followed by Cary Grant saying to her, after he's been watching her, he says, "Hasn't it occurred to you," he says, "that I'm having a tough time keeping my hands off you?" She melts, and after a moment, her cutlery crashes to the table. One kind of spell has been broken, another kind has been cast.
Yeah, it's a terrific scene. And you're right, it's short, but it stuck with me. I write in my book that manners growing up at the table were important to my parents. My mother had sort of learned hers at home. We're in West Virginia now. Her father was the manager of a bottling plant in a small town called Fairmont, West Virginia. My father's father was a coal miner. My dad had gone to West Virginia University and learned his manners at a fraternity house, which back then they were strict about things like this, right? And you dressed for dinner, and I eat in that American style. And anyway, you watch her sort of international manners, and I remember being a kid going, "Wow, look at that," and noticing the style of them.
You actually talk about, I don't think I have this passage right in front of me right now, but you talk about your grandfather and the meals, the Sunday meals that you had there, and how important those were to him. And I love that part, because it's just another example of you letting us into your life and sharing that with us.
Yeah, he was a character. My grandfather Archie, the coal miner, and later in his life he went into real estate, and he had a knack for it, and he did pretty well for himself at the end of his life. But he would go out and shoot a deer every year with bow and arrow, and I grew up eating venison, God, nearly every day in his house, fried up and sometimes in roasts. And when you're a kid, that stuff is pretty gnarly sometimes, at least it seemed to me at the time. And now I revere venison in all its forms. And I do write in this book also, by the way, this is a slight tangent, but I write a bit about being a member of this eating group in New York City. It's called the Organ Meat Society, and I've been a member for about 8 years, and we go out once a month or so and eat things like liver and kidneys and brains and fried intestines, and it's fun, and it's a fun group.
So the other film you mentioned is Big Night. Stanley Tucci plays the I guess he's the front of the house brother, and then his other brother, his brother, is the chef in the kitchen. This is about a restaurant in New Jersey, an Italian restaurant in New Jersey that is kind of out of step with the Italian American food that is in vogue. And because they're trying to serve, we'll say, food like they would have eaten in Italy. And there's a very poignant scene at the end of that movie where the chef, Primo, makes an omelet for Stanley Tucci and one other person who's there. I believe I've got that right.
Yeah.
And there's you quote a writer, Max Watman, holds that there are two types of people in the world: those who come away from Big Night thinking about the labor-intensive timpano that Chef Primo makes, and we'd have to define what that is, and hopefully you'll go into that, and those who come away thinking about the eggs.
Right, right. I mean, Big Night, it's one of the great American movies. I mean, it's just an almost perfect movie that I've seen again and again and again. And, the whole movie is about these two brothers who own this restaurant, preparing for Louis Prima, the band leader, to possibly come in their restaurant, be a big night for them, and might help save their restaurant. And so the chef spends the whole evening preparing this enormous dish called a timpano, which frankly, I've never had. It's rare to see a timpano, but it looks like a massive kind of lasagna, but except like 9 times the size of a typical lasagna. And it's round and it's stuffed with layers and it looks delicious. And I've dreamed about having one. But my friend Max pointed out, I mean, the movie ends with this beautiful scene. Well, screw it. The movie's old now. I'll give it away. Louis Prima never comes. And in the morning, they're kind of all heartbroken and they're back in the kitchen. And Stanley Tucci's character makes this beautiful omelet. And I describe him in my book. It's like watching Charlie Chaplin's The Tramp. The look on his face is so sensitive and profound. And watching him cook these eggs and the care he takes is so moving. And what my friend Max is saying, basically, that kind of simple care, that omelet is really the great moment, the great food scene in this movie, not the one cooking the enormous timpano, which looks delicious, but and somehow not as simple, not as poetic in a way as the eggs were.
If I recall, I think it was mostly in silence too that he's making that.
Good memory. Yeah, they're all silent, and he just kind of comes in and he does this thing, and it's just, as I write, I think in my book, it's just a sign that life goes on. I think I talk about this as well. There's a, I'm going to end that. Cut that out.
Okay, good. Tea rather than coffee.
Yeah. The older I get, I find that tea agrees with me a bit more. And I've gotten more serious about it. I talk about the two great tea writers. I mean, one of them is George Orwell, who wrote one of the best things he ever wrote, I think, was an essay about how to make tea, which your listeners can find easily in his books. Christopher Hitchens, the late Christopher Hitchens, also wrote a lovely piece about tea, which is online. He wrote it for Slate magazine. Coffee has more of a lore. Growing up, at least if you're like me, you wanted to be one of the cool kids and drink your coffee black and start smoking cigarettes when you're 12, so you can be like Charles Bukowski. But and I still drink a lot of coffee every day, but the older I get, I find tea it agrees with me, and I drink it all day.
I think that the other thing that it occurred to me is, in relation to that, I just want to read one part from the book about that is Tom Hodgkinson, a book called How to Be Idle that you've read twice, a self-help book, said he loathes coffee. He thinks it's for guilt-ridden strivers, money obsessives, and status-driven, spiritually empty lunatics. Tea, on the other hand, to his mind, is, quote, the ancient drink of poets, philosophers, and meditators.
Well, I recommend Tom Hodgkinson's book to all of your listeners. It's called How to Be Idle. It's just about how to be a slacker, really, but in a really artful, sort of fun way. I mean, how to enjoy the time you have for yourself in the best possible manner. And he hates coffee because you're right. He's just for go-getters, and nothing wrong with being a go-getter, but he's not. At least he pretends not to be. And he'd rather lay about and drink his tea than get up and run to work with his cup of coffee. And it's a terrific book that I quote several times in my own book.
I actually was mortified to learn that Amanda Hesser doesn't like toasters.
I know. What's with that? I mean, your listeners probably know who she is. She was a longtime New York Times food writer. Now she runs Food 52, a very successful food website, and she's the editor of the New York Times cookbooks, the enormous cookbooks that the papers put out. And she's a great foodie, but she's a weirdo. She doesn't like a toaster. Who doesn't want a toaster in their house? She thinks that they take up too much space on the. But I mean, I use mine 3 times a day, so I couldn't imagine living without it.
Well, it's not just that they take up too much space, that the oven does a better job.
Right. That's weird.
It's just not true. I mean, that's it. Forget it. Anyway,
we all have our quirks.
I guess. I wonder if you would share the story that Joyce wrote about Jack Kerouac, because this is just another example of some of the insights that those of us who may be familiar with some of these literary people, but don't have the depth of familiarity. So if we know that Jack Kerouac, and we read On the Road, or we read the Dharma Bums or something like that, we wouldn't have any idea about this part of the story related to Jack Kerouac. And but you shared that with us because you talk about how Johnson and Jack Kerouac met on a blind date. She was waiting for him in a Howard Johnson's diner of sort on 8th Street in Manhattan. It was 1957, a freezing January night. He was 34 and struggling. The publication of On the Road was still 9 months away. She was 28 and barely out of college. He was broke, and she bought him a meal. And maybe I should just keep reading.
Well, but maybe you should. But I'll say before you do that, Joyce Johnson was a terrific writer, and she's still with us. She is still a terrific writer. She dated Jack Kerouac when she was young, and she wrote a book about it. It's called Minor Characters. It's one of my favorite books. It's just a beautiful, beautiful memoir, coming of age in New York City and around Columbia University in the 50s. And the Jack Kerouac stuff takes up maybe half of the book. And in this scene, she talks about being set up by the poet. Allen Ginsberg sets her up with Jack Kerouac on a date. She's 28, he's 35. He's sort of a man already. He's about to become famous from On the Road. She's 28. She's not a girl anymore, but from her telling, she's sort of still innocent of the big city ways. And here she is with Jack Kerouac in this diner, and it's the first time she's ever bought a man a meal. She loves to watch him eat. It's a very sort of earthy scene. And I as a reader of fiction and a reviewer of fiction, give me earthiness. I mean, I like ideas in fiction, and I like to know there's a grander scheme sometimes in what I'm reading, but I like fiction that glides closer to the earth and talks about our appetites, whether sexual, food, how we really live. And this book is in some ways about being a voyeuristic reader. A lot of my voyeurism as a reader is about food. And this scene in her book is just beautiful. And you've read most of it already.
Yeah, there's another line that I want to read from it, because when you talked about that, that she bought him his dinner, and she wrote, "I've never bought a man dinner before. It makes me feel very competent and womanly." I thought that was a very interesting sentence. I not to analyze it or anything like that. It just kind of struck me very.
Yeah. She's a special writer. There's a fair amount in this book about diners. The great writer Cormac McCarthy, who died last year, a lot of diners in his fiction. Bukowski, of course, was a sort of laureate of the diner. And I think I say in the book that they're just about my favorite places. I think that if I had to pick one food to eat at least every lunch the rest of my life, it'd probably be every day. It'd probably be, a turkey club, and you just can't go wrong with a turkey. I mean, you can, I suppose, but it's hard to go wrong with a turkey club. And whether at a hotel or a diner or, it's like always the safest bet.
I was talking to his name's escaping me right now. I'm sure you would know who he was. He's written a number of books on diners, and Turkey Club is his go-to. And he said there's really only a couple of places that are around anymore in the East where they actually roast the turkey on the premises. So you get we'll call it a real turkey club, for example. Now, I want to go back to Cormac McCarthy, because if I'm not mistaken, you spent more time talking about him in this book. 5 pages in the entire book were devoted to talking about Cormac McCarthy, different things. And I wonder if you could just share just some aspect of his writing with us.
Well, he's such a unique writer. I mean, he became famous for his book Set Out West, the Border trilogy. And those books have a lot of characters, sitting around campfires and grilling haunches of meat and drinking coffee. But his earlier work had a lot of scenes set in diners, and his more recent work, and he published two novels, not last year, end of the year before, 2022, and one of them is set in New Orleans, and it's just an amazing and funny and shrewd food novel. It's sort of like the main character is kind of a guy like Cormac himself, kind of a a nifty guy at loose ends in New York, in New Orleans, and he's not really a foodie himself, but he's got some foodie friends, and there's just some very funny and smart scenes about what to eat and why, and what to drink and why. And it's the earthiest, I won't say earthiest, it's the most sophisticated Cormac's ever been about food, because he kind of always pretended to be a man of simple tastes, And in this novel, he lets it all hang out a bit more, and I love that. But diners, in his early novels like Suttree, there's crazy scenes set in diners. Often big moments happen in diners. And somehow I think food seems more important in Cormac's novels, or it lifts off the page more because his characters live so close to the bone. There's so much depravity and poverty and even horror in his novels that food is often sort of the one bearable part of an unbearable existence for his characters.
Something you and I disagree on. Once a year, you write, or so. I taste an olive oil that makes me want to devote time to chasing down the ineffable ones. Day in and day out, I make do with the extra virgin from California Olive Ranch, which is affordable and widely available. I'm mostly in agreement with the narrator of James Hamilton Patterson's witty novel, Cooking with Fernet Branca, who thought that olive oil snobs are even worse than wine snobs. I'm sorry. I don't think that we are, and I think that it's worthwhile to spend a little time learning about the olive oil that you use, because for me, olive oil is the oil that I use more than any other, and my elbow, works very, very well when it comes to adding olive oil to something, so I want it to be good.
Well, I say early on in this book that like you probably, like your listeners, I'm snobby about a million things, but I'm not snobby about a million other things. We all pick our battles, right? And again, to go back to my wife, Cree, who's just more sophisticated than I am in every aspect of life, she probably has 3 different kinds of olive oil, and she uses them for different things. The finer one to just touch something up or in a salad dressing, and the more basic ones for sautéing, that kind of thing. So I get it. I totally do. Life is too short. I have this kind that I like, and I pretty much use it all the time. But then again, I'm sure you could convince me, if we went out for a drink, you would talk me into getting your varieties and giving them a shot.
Well, we actually have to go out for a tasting, but we could do that. But here's another thing, that unless I missed this, you talk about how there's this one hot sauce that you love. You go back to over and over again. Mar Charos, is that how you say it?
It's called it's called Marie Sharp's.
Marie Sharp's. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I took a picture of that page, and then that's how it got translated, interestingly enough. Anyway, but I looked on their website, and there's like 7 or 8, 9, 10, maybe more hot sauces. I don't think you say specifically which one is your go-to.
Oh, well, they do have a basic one. It's their basic. It's a habanero, and I forget now. It's less vinegary than some are. I find its taste to be more true, and its heat is just on point. The heat does not overwhelm the taste, and I find it to be the ideal everyday hot sauce. But I've gotten more mail about this than anything I wrote in the book, because everyone's got their favorite hot sauce, right? So, but this is mine. We can all fight about it someday. One of the things we're going to do actually next month, my kids love this more than anything. We have what we call a hell night once or twice a year, in which everything on the table is very, very, very hot. And we're about to do this in February this year. And everyone's going to bring one dish, and we're going to try to blow each other out of the water. Okay,
I will read the part from the book about that. So once a year, he decided to really go for it. This is actually about Chris Schlesinger's Hell Night, right?
Chris Schlesinger had a restaurant in Cambridge called the East Coast Grill, and he would have a night called Hell Night once a year.
Mm-hmm. And this is what you wrote about that. On Hell Night, the air inside East Coast Grill was so picante that some of the chefs breathed through gas masks. The heat of the dishes in long sequence made me numb. I felt I'd been zapped by mutant radiation like in a 1950s horror movie. When you were clearly really suffering, young servers in the manner of 1940s cigarette girls would come by with an antidote. They'd hand you a creamsicle. Once a year in November, when our kids and their friends are around for Thanksgiving, we honor Schlesinger by staging our own Hell Night. It's a cruel to be kind sort of adventure.
It's fun. We dress for the occasion a bit. Someone will ring horns and put them on their head or on the chef's head. And what's fun about it is trying to make it really serious, but not. There's no fun in just buying, one of these crazy XXX brands and pouring it on your wings. I mean, that's cheating. So the trick is to make it delicious and still fry your intestines. So we'll see how it goes this year.
I hope that we'll get a report somewhere. I'm not sure where you'll do that. Tell us a little bit about the cookbooks, because again, if I missed this, I want to find out, because you say that you use the same 8 or 9. I know you mentioned something from John Thorne once or twice in the book, but I don't think you ever give us more of a clue as to which 8 or 9 those are that you go to over and over again.
Oh, well, my wife and I own about 400 cookbooks. And I like to use them. And here's why. Well, first of all, there's a great search engine called Eat Your Books. And you tell the search engine which cookbooks you own. And then if you have an ingredient, let's just say, broccoli rabe, you enter that into the search engine. It tells you where to find recipes in the books you already own. And this matters to me because when I'm cooking something, I don't want to find a recipe online and make like Doug from Des Moines. I mean, no problem. I have no issue with you, Doug from Des Moines. But the recipe you put up for broccoli rabe, why should I cook yours when on my shelf there's Marcella Hazan and there's Julia Child and there's Paul Bocuse and Anthony Bourdain and Maher Joffrey right there on my shelves? And so I like to use my books. I want to commune with the greats and not with the sometimes dumb and advertisement-laden recipes you find when you do a search on Google, right? But the cookbooks I use the most, this is embarrassing, but it's true, because I like the books that are anthology cookbooks. The New York Times cookbooks are great. I'm not just plugging my own company. It's because it's a history of all the recipes that have appeared here in the New York Times, and they're not just from the Times people, they're from restaurants all over the world. And so they're sort of time-tested recipes. Ditto Saveur magazine. Some of your listeners may know, a food magazine. They have an omnibus cookbook that I find to be outrageously good. Ditto Gourmet magazine's big one. I like Jacques Pepin's cookbooks. There's one called like The Best of Jacques Pepin, and it's just spread out and all kinds of recipes, and I use it all the time. But I have other favorites in different genres, Maher Joffrey for Indian, of course, and Marcella Hazan for Italian, and onward like that. But I just like to leave them out and look through them all day and look for inspiration. So that's what I do with my cookbooks.
Now, unless people think that all you do is read, there's some keywords about swimming and naps. Do you want to share?
Yeah, well, you need a break every day. I'm a huge napper. I like, because I have a full-time day job, and I also work on books, and I like to put in a full day working for the New York Times. Then I'll have a nap maybe after lunch, a late lunch, and I really go for it with my naps. I mean, I have pants. My wife calls them pants-off naps, but I'll crawl under the covers and sleep for an hour or so, or an hour and a half, and then I'll get up. I will take a shower. Showers are a crucial part of it because it kind of restarts your engines and makes you feel fresh. And then I'll go and do some other work for the rest of the day, or go back to Times work, depending on the day. But I also like to swim whenever possible. I think swimming is one of the great things about being alive. And as someone pointed out too, there's no better way to get hungry again if you feel like you're not hungry than to jump in some water. Suddenly your appetites are back. And it's also a way to take off a drink if you're drinking too much. Go for a swim, and suddenly you're half sober again. So swimming fixes almost everything.
Seems like you might need to have somebody watching you if you're in that kind of shape, though, when you're swimming.
Good point.
Oh, Nathan Myhrvold's meal with Ferran Adria. Can you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, well, Nathan Myhrvold is, of course, the Microsoft. He's a billionaire and experimenter and great foodie who wrote a book about sort of what was the book called? It was Molecular Gastronomy, but it had a title.
Modernist Cuisine.
What's it called?
Modernist Cuisine, I think.
Oh, Modernist Cuisine, right. It was a $600 cookbook, enormous, and very scientific. I had a 50-course meal he put on in his laboratory in Seattle that he did for Ferran Adria, the great Spanish chef, who also does molecular gastronomy. And I write about, it was a treat to be there, but it's also one of the worst meals of my life because it was 50 groaning courses under fluorescent lights, and with publicists at the table, and with wine for every course. And by about 25 courses, I was hitting my limits. But I will give Ferran Adria credit. He stuck it out and clearly can put away more food than I can. But I think it goes to show you that what we eat often matters less than who we're eating it with. And that's part of the point I'm making in this book. By quoting so many writers, I'm sort of talking about my favorite people to think about and that I wish I were eating with, were I to eat with anyone. And besides my family at any rate.
One book that I remember actually that dealt with that in a very poignant way was One Last Lunch. I'm sure you might be. Do you recall that book? It was written by Joseph Heller's daughter. She asked people to write a story about who they would have lunch with if they had one opportunity to have that lunch with them.
Yeah, I love stuff like that. I never agree with anyone's answers. I want to have my last lunch with a bunch of big eaters and funny people. Everyone's like Gandhi. I bet Gandhi be no fun to eat with. Great man. But give me Samuel Johnson. Someone where Mark Twain. I don't know, Hunter S. Thompson. Anyway, but big livers and people who are fun to be around are the kind of people I'd want to have my last lunch with.
Well, I think that's perfect because at the end of the book, you talk about last meals. And this is what you wrote. Over time, I have mentally pared my wishes down. I'd want the great and familiar. 2 martinis, then a first course, mozzarella and tomato, as selected by Cree, who knows what she is doing with basil and olive oil and salt. Then a roast chicken, perhaps with onions and carrots and sausages and halloumi tucked into the roasting pan, with frite and asparagus. A bottle of wine, finer than the decent but unobtrusive bottles we drink nightly. I don't have a sweet tooth, so no dessert. Et voila, I'm fortified for my walk to home plate.
Aren't last meals the best? I love reading about them. I used to think that I'd want, a lot of sort of grand things as sort of a feast worthy of a Roman emperor. But I now think, something fairly simple that I love. Nora Ephron, the great food writer and also film director and journalist, wrote that we should be careful and not wait to have our last meals, because if you wait and don't have them once in a while, you'll end up in some godforsaken place having someone spooning you applesauce in a hotel bed, or excuse me, in a hospital bed. And so she basically says, have your last meal once a week, and really enjoy it. And I think I do.
Dwight, thank you so much. Dwight Garner has been my guest. The Upstairs Delicatessen, his new book on eating, reading about eating, and eating while reading.
Thank you, Steve. Yeah.
It's been a real pleasure.
That was fun. Thanks for asking me.
You've been listening, watching maybe. Great taste, 60 minutes of deliciousness. I'm your host, Steve Boss.
Great taste. Sweet. Sour. So good the taste.